Alright guys, so welcome back to our last video in our Unit 5 on environmental microbiology. So we've been through some of the important biogeochemical cycles in the ecosystems, and now let's take a couple of minutes to go through some important environmental microbiology. Let's talk about our three different vehicles that we talked about in our abiotic environment. We've got soil, we've got air, and we've got water. Now let's have a look at what organisms are living in the soil. And if we look down through here, we've got mostly aerobic bacteria are for the most part what we find in soil. We'll find some that are anaerobic, and then we'll also find those actinomycetes that we talked about earlier, which are the denitrifiers. So they make up almost all of the common soil bacteria. We'll also have fungi, and then others would be stuff like viruses and so on and so forth. But the most important thing, the most important role, where what niche these guys would fit into, is to that decomposer role. So those bacteria that are here are mostly for breaking down organic material from complex molecules into smaller molecules that can be readily used for other species of bacteria, for themselves, or for more complex organisms. Now, if we look at microorganisms that grow in the air, generally we don't have any that can grow there. I mean, they may be there for short periods of time if they're on dust particles or water droplets, but they generally don't live and grow in the air. The air in buildings, of course, would be much more likely to have microorganisms in it, because there's higher dust particles, because there's higher moisture content. You have people in buildings, so the people are sweating, breathing, coughing, and generally there tends to be poor circulation. So air in buildings would be more likely to have microorganisms present than you would see in the atmosphere. Now, the most common form of microorganisms found in the air is mold, and you guys know, if we were to take a plate and just sit it out on our bench overnight, come back the next day, I can almost guarantee that we'd have some species of mold growing, some species of fungi growing when we came back to check it the next day. Alright guys, our most important abiotic feature that we talked about in previous slides in terms of microbial activity is going to be water. Now, all life on this planet, except for in a few very rare cases, does require water in a fair amount. If water is polluted, and polluted means if it contains substances that make it unhealthy or unpleasant, then we may not be able to use that water for drinking or for any other processes that we need. And microbial infiltration, so that means heavy growths of microbes, can make water polluted and render it useless or dangerous. Some of the pollutants that we're talking about, come from organic waste that you'd see from like a garbage dump, industrial waste that you'd see from industry that leach out of settling ponds and so on, sewage and farm manure, and radioactive substances. So if these things were to find their way into water, we could end up in a situation where that water is no longer useful to us. We certainly couldn't drink it without getting sick or very sick. So it takes away that water that we desperately need. Another consideration that we need to talk about when we're talking about water pollution is this idea of eutrophication. Now, eutrophication is when we have a large amount or an excessive amount of organic waste in a waterway. So our lake or a pond, like we see in this picture next to us, has a ton of organics, and a lot of times what will happen is, if there's organic presence in the water, these excess nutrients will promote the growth of algae and bacteria. So just like we see in this pond right here, this is a result of eutrophication, and this is what we call a massive growth, is what we call a bloom. Now, what happens in a bloom is we get populations of algae and bacteria increasing at a startling rate. And you can see the water there is really really, really green. So there's a lot of different cells that are living in that water. Now, to have all of those cells in there, and they're all going to be respiring, they're all going to need oxygen, it's going to cause a massive demand on oxygen in that system. And unfortunately, it's going to end up to the point where there's going to be too many cells there, and they're going to use up all of the oxygen that are in that body of water. So the biological oxygen demand is how much oxygen it would need to keep this system here, and in our case we're talking about our little pond here, to keep this healthy, to keep all the organisms in there living, and also the amount of oxygen required to break down those wastes. So don't forget that these guys, even though their population is quite high, they're going to die, and when they do, those cells are going to start to decompose, and that needs oxygen too. So areas where we have eutrophication, we have very high biological oxygen demand, BOD. And this is something we look at when we're looking at quality of water. What's the BOD, or the biological oxygen demand? Now, we all know that we need to drink water every day in order to stay healthy. And water is, or can be, a very powerful vehicle for transmission of pathogens. So if we have a look here on this side of the graph on the left side, you'll see a whole list of different organisms. And then on this side right here, you'll see a whole list of different diseases that these organisms cause. So you can see that if you're drinking water that's contaminated by some of these organisms, you can get some pretty terrible diseases. Just for example, we talked about Giardia, and we also talked about Cryptosporidium in the lab, and we talked about their life cycle, we talked about what they do, what they cause, so you know it can be pretty horrible. Very often in places where we have poor hygiene, this bacteria here in particular, Vibrio cholerae, causes Asiatic cholera. This can be a very nasty infection, and a lot of places where you have natural disasters and the infrastructure is damaged, then one of the major worries is going to be infections of cholera, because we don't have any way to treat and get clean water for people. So and this list isn't comprehensive by all means. There's more pathogens that can be transmitted in water, but this is some of the stuff that we need to be careful about, we need to avoid, so that nobody gets sick and we have clean drinking water. So we have systems in place to treat our water so that we have clean drinking water for everybody. And we have different levels of treatment. You can have large-scale treatments, and that can be just a treatment of chlorine or bleach. You can have small-scale treatments that can do the same thing. And a lot of the times what we look as the model organism, or the one we're most interested in, is this group of bacteria that we call the coliform bacteria. So they're rod-shaped, they're gram-negative, they don't form spores, they can be motile or non-motile, they can ferment lactose with the production of acid and gas when they're incubated at 35 to 37 degrees Celsius. So those are the conditions we look for to identify a coliform bacteria. If you find coliform bacteria in your drinking water, you're quite likely, above a certain level that is, you're quite likely to get sick from it. And a very typical species of a coliform would be E. coli. So Escherichia coli is a typical coliform bacteria. So we look at our sewage, so our water that's been used in households, used in communities, and we try and treat that water so that we get rid of coliform bacteria, so we're not polluting our other waters, and we get rid of any major pollutants so that that water can be safe to use for other uses. Now, if we look at sewage treatment, we end up with all of the stuff that comes out of your household. 99% of it is contaminated water, and we can hopefully fix that. 1% of that is going to be solid waste. So that's household waste, so you get feces, detergents, grease, and hair that comes out of your tap, in your bath, and your toilets and stuff. And then we also have industrial waste, so the acids, oils, chemicals, or organic matter. This would all contribute to, these are all pollutants that we would find in typical sewage water. Now, we have 3 levels of treatment for sewage. We have primary, secondary, and tertiary. Now, we're going to talk really briefly about these now, but you're certainly going to get more information about these as you get into higher courses. Now, our basic water treatment are this primary and secondary forms of treatment. A primary treatment is when we take raw sewage, so this is sewage that comes from the pipe that leaves your house, that comes from the drain that catches the rainwater, and we pass that raw sewage through a screen, and that screen is going to separate out the solids and the liquids. The solids are going to go into a sedimentation, into a field, and the water is going to move into some tanks, sedimentation tanks. Now, from there, the solids will be transported away, and the liquids will be brought into secondary treatment. The effluent, so the water liquid portion of the primary treatment is put in through these trickle filters, these activated sludge, and the aerobic breakdown of organic matter. So these are all different types of treatments that help get rid of organic material that we find in the effluent. So very often we use bacteria in these treatments to get rid of these organic matter, the sludge, and other bacteria that's present in this effluent. At the end of primary and secondary treatment, we look at the biological oxygen demand, and if the BOD is within reason, within certain levels, then this can be released into rivers, streams, and oceans, and it will be diluted, and it'll become less and less concentrated, and it'll be fine, and it won't impact the environment. Now, we can add another level on top of that, and that's the tertiary treatment. Not all places will have a tertiary treatment, but when we do have tertiary treatment, instead of releasing the effluent from the secondary treatment into the environment, what we do is we process that even further, and we try and get rid of the phosphates and the nitrates that are in that effluent. And the reason why we do that is because these are excellent fertilizers. So these are nutrients that you can have algae and you can have bacteria using to grow. So if we get rid of these, then we discourage increase in biological demand, and we decrease the amount of pollution that's in that the treatment. So we'll have more filtrations, we'll have places where we have denitrifying bacteria, so that'll remove some of the nitrogenous compounds. Then we'll use chlorine, and we'll use ultraviolet light to kill any bacteria that's left. And then basically we're left with clean, almost drinking water. So a tertiary system will take raw sewage and turn it into something that's completely harmless to the environment. Now, if we have a look at this figure right here real quick, this shows us a sewage treatment plant, and it's got it divided into 6 stages. So step 1 and 2 is going to be our primary treatment. So this is going to be a filter where we separate out the fluids, and the solids come down here, and the solids get trucked away or treated. From 1 and 2, we move into steps 3, 4, and 5. This is going to be our secondary treatment. So from here, the effluent is pumped into settling tanks, and again, there will be sediment that settles out from here. There will be filters, activated charcoal filters that'll take stuff, even more stuff out of the water. The sediment that's settling out, of course, that's going to get pumped into trucks and carried away. And then we move into steps 5 and 6, and these are going to be our tertiary treatment. So in these steps here, we're going to remove those nitrates and phosphates, and then eventually we're going to have clean water put back into the environment.